294 against, 354 for, a government erased by numbers. Yet behind these figures lies a paradox that history cannot ignore. Same empire that once carved borders across Africa now fails to draw even a budget line at home. The proud republic that lectured others on stability has become the pupil of chaos, staggering under its own weight. On the 9th of September 2025, Prime Minister François Beu fell, and with him collapsed the illusion that France could forever command both its parliament and its past. This fall is not about a 44 billion euro budget cut, nor about the arithmetic of deficit and debt. It is about an empire of sand slipping through the fingers of Paris. The echoes of Africa's defiance now resound in the marble halls of the Assemblée Nationale. What we are witnessing is more than political turnover. It is the unmasking of a state that cannot command itself, yet once claimed to command the world. Do not look away. This story may change how we see Africa and France forever. Subscribe and keep watching. On the 9th of September 2025, the lights inside the French National Assembly dimmed under the weight of history. François Beu, the prime minister appointed barely months earlier, watched his government disintegrate in a confidence vote he could not survive. The numbers spoke with cold precision. 354 lawmakers rejected his austerity-driven budget, leaving only 194 in support. Within minutes, the prime minister's resignation became inevitable, a ritual humiliation in the presence of both allies and adversaries. At the heart of this collapse was a budget designed to slash 44 billion euros from state spending. On paper, it was framed as a responsible act, a gesture of seriousness towards Brussels and the markets that measure a nation's worth by deficits and debt ceilings. Yet behind the arithmetic lay a society weary of sacrifice. France's debt had swollen to 114% of its gross domestic product, while its deficit stood at twice the European Union's limit. These figures were not mere statistics. They were symptoms of a deeper illness, a republic stretched thin, its machinery grinding under the strain of perpetual crisis. François Beu was not the first casualty. He was Macron's fourth appointment in just over a year, the fifth since 2023. What France presented as democratic turnover was, in truth, a carousel of fragile governments, dizzying to watch but going nowhere. Each new leader arrived with promises of renewal, only to stumble against the same arithmetic of debt, austerity, and public rage. By the time Beu presented his budget, the public's patience had evaporated, and the Assembly's fragmented factions refused to tighten the belt any further. The image of collapse was almost theatrical. In a chamber adorned with centuries of Republican symbolism, the vote revealed a republic unable to govern itself. The Prime Minister's fall was not a sudden accident, nor an unforeseeable misstep. It was the inevitable snap of an overstrained system. France had long cultivated the myth of stability, contrasting itself with nations it deemed fragile. But as its leaders fell one after another, that myth dissolved into irony. The collapse also carried a symbolism sharper than any economic data. For decades, Paris had wagged its finger at Africa, criticizing instability whenever a leader was toppled under pressure. Yet here in the heart of Europe, France was ousting prime ministers like dominoes. The hypocrisy was difficult to ignore. How could a state that lectured others on order now prove incapable of sustaining a government through a single budget season? But Beu's downfall was more than a domestic humiliation. It marked the unraveling of a political order that had hidden behind illusions for too long. Each failed government, each abandoned reform, each protest spilling into the boulevards chipped away at the facade of French authority. When Beu's cabinet dissolved, it was not just a political leader who fell. It was the mask of stability itself. And this raises the question that burns beyond Paris. If France can no longer keep its own house in order, what happens to the empire of influence it once projected across the world? The answer lies not in the halls of the Assemblée Nationale, but in the deserts and cities of Africa, where the echo of France's collapse was already resounding. When the vote in the Assembly was lost, the shockwaves did not stay confined within the chamber's marble walls. They surged outward, spilling into the boulevards of Paris and Marseille, where the discontent of ordinary citizens was already simmering. Within days, strikes paralyzed the transport networks, marches swelled across city squares, and chants drowned out the rhetoric of politicians. What had begun as parliamentary arithmetic ignited into a street rebellion. Teachers demanded to know why they must sacrifice pensions for a government that had squandered authority abroad. Health workers asked why they should endure wage freezes while the state clung to illusions of global grandeur. Union leaders mobilized in anger, framing the austerity plan as not only unjust but also purposeless. And the crowds listened. Placards and slogans captured the fury of a nation that had lost faith in its rulers. Why cut deeper into lives already strained when the promised strong France no longer existed? The hypocrisy could not have been more glaring. For decades, Paris had scolded African nations for instability, claiming that protests and uprisings proved weakness. Yet here, in the heart of Europe, tear gas filled the boulevards. Riot police charged demonstrators, and the state scrambled to portray chaos as order under pressure. The scenes in Paris mirrored the very images France once condemned in Bamako or Ouagadougou. To many across Africa, the irony was delicious. And indeed, African leaders seized the moment. In Bamako, in Ouagadougou, in Niamey, the rejection of French dominance had already been written into new policies and public declarations. Commentators in Mali and Burkina Faso openly mocked Paris, pointing out that the self-proclaimed teacher of democracy could not keep its own house in order. For Ibrahim Traoré and Assimi Goïta, France's implosion was more than news. It was vindication, proof that sovereignty taken back from Paris was sovereignty secured. Internationally, the reactions diverged. Within the European Union, nervous officials spoke of a temporary crisis, attempting to downplay the collapse. Brussels worried less about France's pride and more about financial contagion. If Paris could not manage its deficit, how long before markets punished the Eurozone as a whole? Across the Atlantic, Washington watched with caution. While the United States did not intervene, analysts noted the symbolism. One of Europe's great powers struggling to maintain coherence at home while simultaneously losing influence abroad. But the most powerful response came not from Brussels or Washington, but from Africa itself. Commentators across the continent framed the collapse as poetic justice. The empire that once dictated terms now faced its own rebellion, not in colonies but in its capital. News outlets in Bamako described it as France's mirror moment. In Ouagadougou, opinion leaders noted that Paris's fall confirmed the wisdom of reclaiming sovereignty. Each expulsion of French troops, each broken treaty, each rejection of Francophonie now appeared not as risk but as foresight. The symbolism cut deep. In the eyes of many Africans, France was finally forced to taste the instability it had long exported. Just as convoys of French soldiers had departed from African soil under pressure, so too did convoys of protesters storm French boulevards under banners of resistance. The imagery was impossible to ignore. Africa rising, France faltering, two stories unfolding in parallel, yet deeply entwined. And this was not simply spectacle. The collapse of Beu's government created a sense of urgency in Paris. Macron attempted to frame it as democratic resilience, insisting that leadership changes were part of Republican vitality. But the French public was not fooled, nor were observers abroad. A carousel of collapsing governments was not a sign of health. It was a symptom of exhaustion. By the end of September, one truth became undeniable. France was no longer capable of maintaining the illusion of control, either at home or overseas. Its own citizens had become the mirror, reflecting back the hypocrisy of a state that preached order, yet practiced chaos. But if Paris was collapsing under the weight of its illusions, what did this mean for the deeper civil and political fabric of the French Republic itself? The fall of François Beu's government did not end with the resignation letter handed to the Élysée Palace. Its echoes rippled across the French Republic, revealing fractures that could no longer be plastered over. For ordinary citizens, the budget defeat was not simply about 44 billion euros. It was about trust broken, sacrifices demanded without reward, and a government that no longer seemed capable of leading its own people. Across the streets of Lyon, Marseille, and Paris, conversations turned bitter. Pensioners asked why their futures had to be frozen so that the state could cling to illusions of grandeur. Workers wondered why they must endure higher taxes to sustain an image of global power that had already collapsed in the Sahel. Families saw their purchasing power shrink, even as Paris pretended it still had the weight to command abroad. The discontent was not confined to political activists. It touched every corner of society. The Assembly's rejection of Beu's budget became a symbol of disillusion. It exposed the gap between the France its leaders spoke of and the France its citizens lived in. For decades, governments had justified austerity by pointing to the need for global influence, arguing that France must tighten its belt today to remain a leader tomorrow. But by 2025, the illusion was broken. Africa had turned the page. The empire was gone, so the sacrifices became pain without purpose. This betrayal left scars on the French political system. Voter turnout plummeted in local elections, with citizens increasingly convinced that no leader could truly alter the trajectory. New parties sprouted, but they fed more on protest than on coherent vision. Meanwhile, established parties bickered, further eroding confidence. France appeared less a Republican renewal than a state in limbo, trapped between an arrogant past and an uncertain future. And here lies the irony. The very instability Paris once condemned in Africa now mirrored itself in French politics. Just as coups in Bamako or Ouagadougou were portrayed as failures of democracy, so too did the carousel of prime ministers in Paris expose a crisis of legitimacy. The comparison was not lost on the world. Commentators drew direct parallels between the collapse in Paris and the uprisings across Africa. What France labeled instability abroad looked suspiciously like instability at home. This parallel grew sharper when Ibrahim Traoré stood as a symbol of defiance in Burkina Faso. The Ibrahim Traoré Coup, once derided by French analysts as reckless, had become a touchstone for sovereignty reclaimed. To many Africans, the sight of France's assembly toppling prime ministers felt like vindication. If Paris could not govern itself, why should it presume to govern others? Traoré's bold rejection of French military presence became more than national policy. It became a metaphor for the wider shift in global legitimacy. For the French citizen in Bordeaux or Toulouse, this link to Africa may have felt distant, yet its consequences were tangible. With each base closed, each contract lost, and each treaty severed, Paris forfeited resources and prestige that once subsidized its domestic stability. These losses translated directly into budget cuts and austerity measures at home. The shadow of Africa's independence hung over French households, even if not spoken aloud. By late autumn 2025, the crisis deepened. Protests hardened into blockades. Political debates ossified into stalemates. The Republic seemed incapable of producing not only a government, but also a vision for the future. The nation was restless, its streets alive with chants, its institutions paralyzed by division. And beneath it all lay a haunting question. If France could no longer command obedience at home, how could it ever reclaim relevance abroad? That question, however, was not answered in Paris. Its answer emerged in the halls of international diplomacy, where the world was beginning to weigh the meaning of a shrinking France and a rising Africa. Beyond the borders of France, the collapse of François Beu's government was read less as a domestic mishap and more as a signal of shifting power in the international order. For decades, Paris had positioned itself as both anchor and arbiter within Africa, a European power capable of commanding respect in Brussels, Washington, and Bamako alike. Yet in the wake of September's vote, those assumptions crumbled as quickly as Beu's mandate. In Brussels, European Union officials scrambled to present the event as an exercise in democratic resilience. The language was carefully chosen. France was not collapsing, they insisted, but recalibrating. Yet beneath the surface, worry rippled through Europe's institutions. A member state with debt at 114% of GDP and a deficit double the EU limit was no longer a stabilizer, but a liability. For leaders in Berlin and Rome, France's paralysis raised urgent questions. How could the Eurozone's second-largest economy project stability abroad if it could not sustain stability at home? Across the Atlantic, Washington's tone was more restrained. The United States did not issue formal condemnation, nor did it intervene directly. Instead, analysts framed the collapse as evidence of Europe's diminishing capacity to manage its own crises. France, once relied upon to anchor Western interests in the Sahel, now looked incapable of anchoring itself. American think tanks pointed out the irony. While Washington recalibrated its global commitments, Paris clung to illusions of grandeur it could no longer afford. But the most decisive voices came from Africa. Leaders in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso used France's political chaos to reinforce their own message of sovereignty. The withdrawal of French troops, the severing of diplomatic ties, and the building of new partnerships with Russia and China were no longer portrayed as risks. They were vindicated as a strategic foresight. Commentators invoked the Burkina Faso Revolution not only as a rejection of colonial legacies, but also as a blueprint for the continent's future. Sovereignty, once seen as fragile, was reframed as strength. The African Union and ECOWAS, long criticized for timidity, also shifted tone. While they did not celebrate France's crisis, their silence spoke volumes. The absence of concern suggested a new reality. Paris was no longer indispensable to regional security. For decades, its presence had been justified as the guarantor of order. Now, with France in disarray, African institutions began to claim legitimacy on their own terms. In this international chorus, the verdict was clear. France's collapse was not simply domestic drama, it was global theater. Every capital that once deferred to Paris now recalculated its position. The Fifth Republic had lost not only its prime minister, but also the illusion of inevitability. And so the question emerged. If France could no longer hold its stage abroad, what path, if any, remained for its future at home? The collapse of François Beu's government was not the end of France's troubles. It was a warning flare of storms yet to come. A republic once proud of its ability to command both its citizens and its colonies now stood exposed, stripped of illusions, forced to confront a future it had long postponed. The pressing question is not whether France has declined, that much is undeniable. The question is what comes next. For Paris, the path ahead appears narrow. Without the scaffolding of African dominance, it must accept a reduced role, less empire builder and more regional actor. The best-case scenario for France is reinvention as a mid-tier European power, focused on Brussels and continental politics rather than on the Sahel or West Africa. No longer can it dictate currencies, treaties, or security doctrines on foreign soil. At most, it may attempt to stabilize itself through European integration. But even that depends on repairing trust at home, a task easier said than done. Yet while France contracts, Africa expands. What once was framed as dependency is now being redefined as sovereignty. In Ouagadougou, gold refineries no longer exist as mere proposals. They are producing hundreds of kilograms daily. In Niamey, the rejection of Francophonie was not a symbolic tantrum, but a deliberate pivot towards economic independence. In Bamako, new partnerships with non-Western allies are funding infrastructure that Paris once neglected. Across the continent, pipelines, railways, and processing plants are being laid not in the name of empire, but in the name of dignity. The symbolism is powerful. As Paris tightens belts, Africa builds bridges. As France rehearses decline, Africa rehearses sovereignty. The continent that was once portrayed as unstable is now writing a new script for itself, while the state that once claimed to be its instructor struggles to follow its own lines. And what of the people? For French citizens, the future is uncertain, marked by austerity and disillusion. But for African citizens, the horizon appears brighter. Each step away from Paris is a step towards self-reliance, a step towards trade over aid, a step towards a dignity that no foreign power can bestow or withdraw. The road ahead is not without risks. New partnerships may come with their own costs, new alliances may test unity, and the legacy of colonial dependence cannot be erased overnight. Yet the trajectory is clear. The 21st century will not be defined by France's illusion of power. It will be defined by Africa's pursuit of sovereignty, which leaves us with the final and most haunting question. If the teacher has stumbled and the student has risen, what future remains for both on the stage of history? The fall of François Beu's government will be remembered not as a technical vote on numbers, but as the unraveling of a story France had long told about itself. The myth of stability, the illusion of grandeur, the pretense of empire, all collapsed under the weight of reality. On the 9th of September 2025, Paris was forced to face a truth Africa had already embraced. Sovereignty cannot be borrowed, it must be owned. For decades, French leaders claimed legitimacy at home by projecting power abroad. Each handshake in Bamako, each parade in Ouagadougou, each military base in Niamey was presented to French citizens as proof that Paris still mattered. But when those symbols vanished, when Africa tore down the scaffolding, the mask fell. What remained was a republic stripped bare, a state in decline. And yet, on the other side of the story, a new chapter is being written. The Burkina Faso Revolution stands as a testament to a continent no longer willing to bend. The gold refineries in Ouagadougou, the new trade corridors in Niamey, the infrastructure projects in Bamako, these are not simply policies, they are declarations of dignity. Africa does not need Paris to define its future. It has begun to define its own. This is why the Ibrahim Traoré Coup resonates so powerfully today. It was not a reckless gamble, as Paris once claimed. It was a signal of sovereignty, a refusal to be lectured by a state that could not govern itself. And as France's assembly toppled yet another prime minister, that coup echoed louder than ever, a reminder that the balance of power has shifted. The age of empire is over. The age of partnership, if Paris dares to accept it, has only just begun. So the story ends not with despair, but with hope. Hope that a continent once silenced now speaks. Hope that sovereignty is no longer an aspiration, but a reality in motion. And hope that history, when it looks back, will remember this as the moment Africa stepped into power. If this resonates with your sense of justice, do not leave. Subscribe, share, and walk with us into the story of tomorrow.